Across TV history, there have been castings that people didn't expect to be good, just like how everyone doubted that Michael Keaton in Batman or Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight were going to be excellent. And there are casting decisions that generate controversy and derision, or at the very least a healthy dose of skepticism. But we're not going to be doubters today. We're going to look at the times where casting choices defied all expectations. As I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are 8 TV performances way better than anyone expected. Number 8. Mark Hamill, Batman the Animated Series. Nowadays, Mark Hamill is almost as well known and far more critically acclaimed for his voiceover work over the last 30 years than he actually is from Star Wars, but back in the early 1990s, that was something of a different story. Despite being the face of one of the biggest franchises ever made, Star Wars didn't make Hamill into a genuine star. That instead went to Harrison Ford, who added the likes of Blade Runner and Indiana Jones to his resume. Continuing on to become a bona fide movie icon, Hamill was unfortunately kind of left with the scraps until that was Batman the Animated Series. He certainly wasn't an obvious choice back then, even though he had dabbled in voice work. He was the fresh-faced farm boy Luke Skywalker, an inherently good guy who was now voicing the most iconic comic book villain ever created. Could he really do it justice? Well, you know what? Hamill wasn't just a fine Joker, he wasn't even just a good Joker, he was utterly incredible, an indelible version of the character, using his voice to purely make it his own and delivering one of the absolute best takes on the character ever committed to screen. Hamill brought an insane energy to the character, a range of emotions through his vocal work, and one of the most brilliant Joker laughs ever heard. Number 7. Matt Smith, Doctor Who. There was a surprising amount of controversy around Matt Smith's casting as the 11th Doctor back in 2009. David Tennant had just announced that he was leaving the role in 2008, which led to months of frenzied speculation, scuttlebutt, and fan casting. But suffice to say, Smith's name wasn't on any single one of the lips of most fans. Coming after Tennant, one of the most popular Doctors ever, it was expected that they would go older, so Smith's casting was a complete shock. He was too young, they said, too experienced, too much of a cheap Tennant knockoff, too unknown. And then came the 11th hour, and it's here that Smith made the role his own. This young Doctor was absolutely brimming with energy and life that we'd not seen really before. He was charming and charismatic and yet felt far more alien than either Eccleston or Tennant's iteration. Over time, he formed some of the strongest, most satisfying bonds with his companions and increasingly added range to the character. He could be quirky and fun, but he could also hit all of the emotional beats as well. He brought a real sense of wonder and otherworldliness to the part without trading on those core human connections that are so very important. Smith wasn't just a Doctor, he became the Doctor. Number 6. Katie Sagel, Sons of Anarchy. Although Katie Sagel was an experienced TV actress before being cast in Sons of Anarchy, she was mostly known for her roles in sitcoms, from Married with Children to 8 Simple Rules. As well as being Leela on Futurama, she had carved out a reputation as a gifted comedic actress, alongside being known for her singing career as well. As we've seen plenty of times though, there's often something great to be found when comedic actors are given dramatic roles, and that happened when she entered Sons of Anarchy. Taking on the role of Gemma, the mother of protagonist Jax, in the dark, violent Sons of Anarchy was seen as something of a risk back then, because it wasn't entirely clear what she'd actually bring to the role, but what she did bring was an absolute powerhouse of a performance. As Gemma, she became not only a key part of the show's narrative, but its emotional core as well. Finally, the actress had shed her comedic background with a portrayal that was contemptible, vicious, manipulative, and yet, at times, devastating as well. Number 5. Robin Wright, House of Cards. Following a breakthrough and an early rise to stardom in the 1980s, Robin Wright's career was on a downward curve by the mid to late 2000s. Now, there was some critical acclaim for 9 Lives and Empire Falls, although neither were widely seen, and she did land supporting parts in big 2011 films Moneyball and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, but she wasn't much on the radar for leading major roles until Netflix came a-calling. Together with Kevin Spacey, Wright was tasked with leading the first big splash onto the original series market, with an update of a British TV show from the 1990s. No one really knew exactly how much to expect from Netflix at this point, neither from House of Cards and certainly not from Wright, but any notions of what this might be were soon surpassed. Now, obviously Frank Underwood was the thing that everyone was talking about, but the longer that the show went on, the more that it was Wright's Claire who started to steal the show. Whereas Frank was deplorable from the get-go and always schemed for one reason only, Claire was much more multifaceted and as such ended up giving Wright a lot more to do. Yes, she was the Lady Macbeth Macbeth type, scheming and conniving every bit as much as her husband, but she was also shown to really care about people and political matters. She became the only fascinating thing even when House of Cards itself had mostly stopped being so, and that was all down to Wright's towering performance. Number 4, Martin Freeman, Fargo. Now, you know what you're gonna get with a Martin Freeman's performance, don't you? That's not to pour scorn on his acting ability, because he is very good at what he does, but it's often within the same wheelhouse from which he operates. From TV roles in The Office and Sherlock to big screen ventures, Love Actually, The Hobbit and the MCU, Freeman gives you a performance that often feels like he's playing a riff off of himself, an awkward and bumbling, dryly funny and pretty nice guy straight man. So when he was cast in Fargo, it seemed like we might get to hear one of these again, albeit with a Minnesotan accent. And at first that did seem to be correct. Freeman's Lester Nygaard is a downbeat insurance salesman who is basically one of life's victims. It's a little more miserable than most of his roles, but not much of a stretch. But then comes the hammer, and when Lester snaps and hits his wife with said hammer, that's when Freeman's performance flips. From then on, we're presented with a wonderful, slimy dichotomy as Lester tries to scheme his way out of trouble, but keeps falling down holes along the way, quite literally come the end. He's violent and vile, and yet still at times makes you believe that he's still the victim here. He tries to play the big man, and which simultaneously shows us how small Lester is as a human. It's not only a great performance, but one that relies on our preconceived notions of Freeman to actually help work. Number 3, Amelia Clarke, Game of Thrones Season 8. Now, like many others on this list, this is not going to praise Amelia Clarke for her entire performance in Game of Thrones. Not that she was necessarily bad per se, but she did come into it as an unknown, like so many of the younger characters did, so there weren't many expectations one way or another. But across the first 7 seasons, she was, both by design and sometimes not, very reserved as Daenerys. There wasn't a great deal of expression from her, not a lot to be gleaned from her line delivery or indeed physical performance. And then Season 8 came around. Now, fans may indeed be split on the season as a whole and Dany's arc in particular, but what cannot be denied is that Clarke absolutely raised her game tenfold during this final season. In the early episodes, we get a sense of her struggle to fit in at Winterfell, from a back and forth with her and Sansa, to her learning the truth about Jon, and we get to see her isolation grow and grow and grow. And then, at the end of the Long Night and the beginning of The Last of the Starks, we get to see not only that, but see it combined with the grief over losing her beloved Jorah. The sight of her kneeling over Jorah's body is a defining moment, and yet it only keeps getting better from there. The shock and anger that comes in the next episode, which then manifests itself into complete rage and a desire to rule with fear, right down to her final moments. Dany's turn was foreshadowed, but it wouldn't have worked without this performance from Clarke. She absolutely sells everything superbly, and most impressive, she does so with very little dialogue, instead using that once inexpressive face to convey a full gambit of emotions. Number 2, Matthew McConaughey, True Detective. When True Detective debuted back in 2014, the McConaissance was already underway, if not quite in full swing. He proved his chops in Dallas Buyers Club, but this was before he'd claimed the Oscar for it, which would then turn far more eyes towards the role and was aided by the True Detective hype as well. And his reputation was still largely that of a faded rom-com surfer dude type. He changed all of that though with Rust Cohle, who is one of the greatest single-season TV characters to have ever existed. Hell, he's one of the greatest TV characters, period. Because here, while McConaughey uses many of his old tricks, like his classic good looks, his alluring southern drawl to draw us in, here the looks are used to juxtapose the older, haggard version of his character. There's a boyish charm contrasted with the almost creepy, unkempt loser that we're seeing. The drawl isn't simply to say, alright, but to pontificate and ponder on life and things even larger still. The philosophy that he spouts in almost anyone else's hands or indeed voice would be at best cliched and at worst laughable, but with McConaughey, you kind of believe it. You root for Rust, even while he can't root for himself. There's something rather ineffable about it, in the way that he is so completely magnetic every time that he's on screen. After all of the years of rom-coms, McConaughey showed us what he is truly capable of in his best performance ever, and there is a victory in that. And number 1, Bryan Cranston, Breaking Bad. Back in the early 2000s, you might not have known the name Bryan Cranston, although you'd have certainly recognized his friendly face. He was to most the dad from Malcolm in the Middle, funny, lovable, a bit dopey, and completely harmless. Smaller roles in the likes of How I Met Your Mother and Little Miss Sunshine did little to suggest that he was much more than a comedic actor, and a supporting one at that. So when a show called Breaking Bad started rolling out, starring the dad from Malcolm in the Middle as a high school chemistry teacher who turns to drugs after a cancer diagnosis, expectations weren't exactly high. In fact, most people didn't notice it at all because it was a few years before Breaking Bad truly caught a flame, but Cranston's performance was working miracles long before the world took notice. It had a humble start, not just in terms of viewership, but Cranston's performance as well. He was still the dad, the likable family man who was funny and that you root for. But the transformation over 5 seasons is one of the greatest character arcs, and indeed some of the finest acting in TV history. Cranston gives this everything. He's desperate and deplorable, pitiful and powerful. He so completely hooks us into the Walter White persona and then knocks us flat with the turn into Heisenberg. The tighty-whities might have been the same, but otherwise you just cannot believe that this is the same man who played Hal. It is a ferocious, truly epic performance, a monolithic showing that belongs in the Pop Culture Hall of Fame.